Come with me to a magical place where being labeled the pork queen is a compliment, where being nice is just a way of life, and where all leaders of the free world must pass through. Welcome to Iowa. Whether you're a current Iowan, an Iowa expat, or an Iowan at heart, this show is for you. This is the Iowa Podcast. Real Iowans, real talk, no drama. I'm Justin Brady, and you probably heard about the executive order President Trump has signed, which looks like it's going to end birthright citizenship, maybe. We're not doing the politics thing today. We have other shows. There are a lot of opinions about this, so we're not going to do that today. We're going to cover, though, the current law, how this stuff works to begin with, and we're going to do that with Lori Chesser, the president of Dentons and an immigration attorney at Dentons, from, of course, right here. Your office is like a couple blocks away from the studio, I think, like over in downtown. Thanks so much for coming on the studio.
Absolutely, Justin. Glad to be here.
So like I told everybody, we're not doing the politics thing. I'm not going to ask you about, your political opinion. There are a lot of opinions on this. This is just an area that I thought, it's just one of those things. I was like, wait a minute. How does this stuff even work? And I feel like it's really, really helpful in the national discussion to have an understanding of how this stuff works. So I thought this was like a cut and dry thing, just my own personal opinion. I thought this was a cut and dry thing. Well, okay, I don't know how he's going to do it, but there's a 14th Amendment that kind of stays in the way, and they're going to have to repeal that, right? But it's actually not as cut and dry and simple as I thought. So I learned a lot going down this rabbit hole, but let's start with the birthright citizenship thing, practically, mechanically. How does that presently work in this country?
Sure. So you can gain citizenship in the United States by being born here. So born on U.S. territory, you are almost always a U.S. citizen. There are a couple exceptions we can talk about. Now, there's other ways to become a U.S. citizen. You could be born outside the U.S. to U.S. citizen parent. So we have sort of two ways to get citizenship: outside the U.S. to a U.S. citizen parent in certain situations, or born here physically on the soil of the United States.
So that is one thing that's interesting, because you hear of people that are traveling abroad, and it's someone has to travel, and she happens to have her child when she's over in Paris, and she's a U.S. She's like, oh no, is my kid going to be a U.S. citizen? The answer to that is yes, because she's a citizen herself.
Oh, well, so it's a really complicated part of the law.
So wait, this is not a simple question?
Usually it
I thought that was a simple question.
I know, usually it is.
Okay.
It's just that, in that scenario, if it's today, as long as that U.S. citizen mother has lived in the United States 5 years, 2 of which are after the age 14, then yes, she would transmit citizenship.
Whoa, so in most cases, yes.
Yeah.
But there are a few exceptions, which is if your citizenship status is fairly new, and you happen to be abroad at the time when you give birth, then maybe.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, and then it even gets,
awesome. I had no
gets
idea.
more fun than that even, Justin, because if the U.S. citizen hasn't lived in the States long enough, maybe the grandparents are citizens and can establish that. So we have a complicated law on birth outside the U.S., but birth in the U.S., we have a very straightforward law. You're born here, you're a citizen.
But you said the key words, which as a podcaster I latched onto, which is almost always.
Yes.
So what is the almost always?
Okay. So there's been a couple of exceptions recognized to that, because the actual wording is born in the United States subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Okay. And what that has always been interpreted to mean is that, for instance, diplomats. So you have a diplomat, they're the ambassador to, name your country, that's working in the United States. They're here on a diplomatic visa. So they're here legal in the U.S., but physically they're in the U.S. Technically, legally, they're not subject to the U.S. jurisdiction. We can't arrest them because they're really representatives of their home country.
Right.
So we don't have jurisdiction over diplomats in that way. So if a diplomat has a child here, they're not a U.S. citizen, which makes sense. They're only here as representatives of their country. It's just a special relationship. The other exception, which I don't think ever has been used, but theoretically, if we had an invading army that had taken over our territory, children born to the members of that invading army would not be subject to our jurisdiction because they've invaded and taken over our territory, right? And so they would not be recognized as U.S. citizens. Thank goodness we've never had that happen.
Thank goodness, yeah.
Yeah. But those are the two exceptions that are considered not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, because everyone else in the United States is arrested for crimes, has to pay taxes, has to follow our laws, can be deported, whatever the case may be, they're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States.
And so that is where things get foggy, right? That's why this isn't so cut and dry. And this is actually a political debate now, because the conversation, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like the conversation is centering around that phrase and those two exceptions you brought up, correct?
Yeah, I think that's where people that are, promoting this are hanging their hat, is that idea of subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Yeah.
Right. And so, because you mentioned the diplomats, and that's a great example, actually. Diplomats are here legally, but they're not here as citizens, and so they'd be invalidated. Or you mentioned, maybe this is why, actually, this is a question for you. Maybe this is why the Trump administration calls it an invasion. Is this why they use that? And you're not a political, again, you're not a political expert, but maybe that's setting some legal, is this a thing people will do, is try to set legal terms? I'm not a lawyer, clearly.
Right. I don't think it would have a legal, I mean, people talk about invasion. It's a very different situation than an army coming in and taking over by force.
It's very different.
And running a territory. If someone came in took over Florida and was set up a government and ran that territory, they would be an invading army, right? This is not happening. But, rhetorically, it's a nice point, I guess, for, in that sense. But legally, I don't think there's anything close to that happening.
But this is where the whole conversation centers, is before I actually, I've read all the amendments, but I don't remember all this stuff, right? So I was reading back through them again to remind myself of how things are written. And that's when I was like, okay, like I said at the beginning of the show, 14th Amendment, if you're born here, you're a citizen, period, end of story. I don't understand how legally they're going to do this. And then I read it and I was like, because the subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and you have people who legally, they're not here legally. That's the center. That's the concern. That's where this whole debate will kind of center on. So that's for the lawyers. That's for the political people to figure that out. But does this temporarily? Because I think the EO executive order is 30 days or something. It goes into
right 30 days. Yeah.
Does this technically pause then birthright citizenship, as it obviously will probably go to the courts? So is there a pause then?
Well, so of course, there's already lawsuits, so it's possible that a court will come in and enjoin, meaning stop the effectiveness temporarily of the executive order. But let's just say it goes into effect in 30 days. So the executive branch, which of course the president and all the agencies, right? The all these agencies like Social Security Administration, the State Department that issues passports, Immigration Service that issues certificates of citizenship or, various documents. The executive tells them what to do.
Yeah.
So basically what the order says is they're ordering the agencies not to recognize someone born here unless they can prove that, either their mother was here not temporarily and legally, so basically a permanent resident or citizen of the U.S., or their father, how that's written. So if you don't satisfy the requirements, then those agencies would not be able to issue birth records to those people as citizens of the United States. Now, they'd still get a birth certificate from the state, right? They issue birth certificates, so someone's been born here. But now we never had an inquiry into this before. And so the inquiry was always, were you born here or were you born outside the U.S.? And if you're born outside the U.S., we have a lot of rules about how we prove that you're still a citizen. If you're born here, you get a passport, you get a social security number. So the agencies will now have to come up with rules, if this goes into effect, have to come up with rules about how they're going to inquire, what kind of evidence would be used to show that. So that's how that would play out.
At the end of the day, it's not a state versus federal thing. Citizenship is a federal thing.
Correct.
So this will go to federal courts, and I would guess probably eventually makes its way to the Supreme Court. But like in the third, let's say it goes into effect, then it basically is birthright citizenship then paused. And if it's paused and people don't get birthright citizenship, and this is overturned later, do we retroactively grant citizenship, or are we like, is there a process here, or are we in total uncharted territory?
Well, so, it's really it's an interpretation. So, if the courts would say, no, this isn't how we change the law, and we should go back and talk about that just a little bit. But, this isn't how we change a rule. So this executive order has no effect. Then the people born here would have their birth certificates, and then the agencies would have to issue them their birth record,
really?
Their passports or whatever.
Wow.
Yeah. So, the fact is you're born here and you're going to have evidence of that.
Right.
And then the question is, what does that do for you? How can you get a passport, for instance? Can you get a social security number? So if you can't get one for a certain period of time, you could then later go back and apply for one if that is the outcome.
Now, you mentioned evidence of that as being born here, which implies there is some chain of, this is probably not the best word to use either, but chain of custody or some kind of proof mechanism or some type of process that exists that, someone's like, I am a citizen, I was born here, here's the evidence of. Does that have to come from a state hospital, or does that evidence take other forms? Like, can you just theoretically, can someone be born here, take a selfie, and then they're like, there's my evidence? Like, what's the burden of proof? Like, how do you prove something like that?
Sure. Well, I don't know if selfie would work, but it's a good thought. So most people are born in a hospital. Yeah. And when you're born in a hospital, the hospital takes records, and then those records are sent to the state, agency that issues those. And so you get a state birth certificate that has certain procedures for making sure that's valid and all that kind of thing. Now, there are people who are not born in a hospital. You could be born in a cab on the way to the hospital, or you could be whatever, but then in that case, you show up at the hospital, it's probably, you're in the hospital. They could probably,
or maybe
an
EMT shows up, and that would be good.
Yeah. Somebody's going to be, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm sure there is a way that they prove that, you're born here. Now, the ones that are more problematic are midwife births in a home. And
really?
Yeah. Now, today, if you're born midwife in a home, there probably is a chain of evidence that's used. That in prior times, there's some that are more informal, and so then you have things like affidavits of the midwife and those kind of things. So it doesn't. And again, not my area of expertise, but I don't know that it comes up so much here. It comes up at the border sometimes. Border areas where people do go back and forth quite a bit between the two countries and have historically done that, back and forth on these border communities. And so sometimes that comes up, and then you have to prove in a court that you were born here.
Wow. So even in those cases, there is some type of, because this is, again, these are things we don't think of.
Right.
Right. Like, if you were born in a cab, like even the midwife in a home thing.
Yeah.
Like, well, okay, I guess I never really thought of that either. That's absolutely fascinating. So that gets, let's just say for the sake of argument, that's hung up in court. It gets overturned for whatever reason. Again, I'm not a lawyer, and who knows where this is going to go. But then if the Trump administration says, no, birthright citizenship is crazy, it shouldn't be a thing. I'm not going to speak for them. But then the next step would be a 14th Amendment. Right? To repeal the 14th Amendment or make another amendment to adjust it. That's really the only next step, correct?
Right. I mean, it's interesting. This birthright citizenship really comes from three different angles in our law. Okay. There is the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that has that language. Okay. There's more. There's more.
Wait.
The other, we actually have a statute that says the same thing. So a federal law that sort of repeats the 14th Amendment. I don't know why we have that, but we have both. And then we've got what's called common law or case law. And that, we have a decision that was in the 1880s, I'm going to say, that had to do with the Chinese person that basically addressed this very same situation that said, no, actually someone born here is a U.S. citizen despite the situation of their parents. And I can talk about that more. But so we've got court decisions interpreting this. We have the 14th Amendment and we have a statute. So, let's say the court upholds all those and says, no, if you want to change this, you have to change something. Then what would have to happen is, yes, constitutional amendment. And then I think you'd have to also change the statute at the same time because you've got both things. Okay. So a statute's changed by Congress, both houses, House and the Senate voting on that. And then, but over and above that, for a constitutional amendment, you have to have a certain number of states that are, that ratify the constitutional amendment. So it's a big process to change. It's usually a years-long process, if it works at all, to get something like that changed. So it's a big process. Yeah,
and it's obviously, it would be silly to assume that this thing will be over in the next few months.
Right.
What I'm hearing you say then is that even if this is like constitutionally perfect, it's probably going to be years if we're lucky. I don't know if lucky is the right term to use. I think everybody knows what I mean. This will take years.
Yes.
If 4 years, it could take even longer than that. And so whatever this fight is about, this is going to be a long, drawn out thing. Does this affect? Well, actually, I want to go back to something you said. You mentioned there was some Chinese individual and that shaped this law. Wasn't this kind of the purpose of the 14th Amendment? Because back, I think people from Africa weren't being granted citizenship, and that was wrong. And so they put the 14th Amendment in there saying, no, you can't, just because people were from, this isn't how it works. Just because people were from Africa doesn't mean they can't be citizens here. Wasn't that trying to be, or wasn't that what the 14th Amendment tried to resolve?
Yeah, so it came after the Civil War. So basically, just to give you a little bit of history, when we started the country, we were looking to England, obviously, for kind of how they did things, right? And in England, and I'm not an expert in English law, but my understanding is that in England, it wasn't in the, codes or statutes. It was a court case, and what they call common law court case back in 1608 that basically said, if you're born on the soil, you're a citizen. Okay, so that was kind of the assumption when we started America. However, at that time, only people who were free people were recognized. So the enslaved people were not recognized as U.S. citizens. So, initially people were brought here against their will from Africa or whatever. And so they weren't born here. But then they started having children. So you had children of enslaved people. And there was the infamous Dred Scott decision.
Correct.
Which basically said if you were born into slavery, you were not a U.S. citizen.
Right.
Okay? Then we fought this war. And then after that, they, put into the Constitution and then to the statute that said basically if you're born here, you are a citizen, as long as, again, they've got this subject to the jurisdiction, which was always, has always been interpreted simply that if you aren't exempt from the laws of the United States in some way, we don't have jurisdiction over you. We can't make you a citizen because we don't even have jurisdiction over you.
Right.
And so that was the reason for that exception. So so then the Chinese, we passed in the 1880s, we passed this Chinese Exclusion Act. And basically the reason for that, just the super quick version of the story is that, Chinese workers came here, built the railroads, did this and that, and then started competing with the U.S. workforce, and people didn't like it. And then they basically went through a restrictionist era. And so they said Chinese people can't become citizens, can't immigrate, whatever. So this person was born to Chinese parents in the United States, and he would travel back to China occasionally, on boats back then. So it was a long journey. Got back one time on a boat and they said, no, you can't come in because you're Chinese. So you're not a citizen, even though you were born here. Well, that went up to the Supreme Court and they said, no. If you're born here, you're a citizen. End of story.
So does this complicate what you do for a living, because you're an immigration attorney. And I guess this is probably a really stupid question. Again, it's one of those things I knew existed. I knew immigration attorneys existed. I know you were in court doing stuff. But what does that even involve? Like, what is it? What is your day to day? What's like a typical case for you? Is that someone was born here and you have to do the chain of custody evidence thing and say, Your Honor, yes, they were born here. They do have, like, is this basically your job? Or is it more complicated? I mean, obviously it's more complicated than that, but.
Yeah. Well, we don't. I mean, this law has been so clear that the only question about U.S. citizenship is if you're born here
Sure.
is typically like, is this a home midwife delivery that didn't have a,
Right.
So most of our job is helping people come here to the United States legally. And a lot of times that's through work. People are offered a job and they need a visa. And so we do that. People get married or their parents are here, all those kind of things. So there's processes for all that. So fortunately, I really don't spend any time in court. Or very rarely. I mostly am just dealing with the administrative agencies, filing forms, explaining why this person fits in this category. And then we help people they can naturalize and get citizenship.
Oh,
which
you
I
do
guess
that
I didn't.
too?
Yeah, which I didn't mention. That's the other way to get citizenship is you can follow all these rules, get your green card, and then you can apply for naturalization to get citizenship. So that's another way, and we help with that. And then immigration lawyers also defend people who the government is trying to remove.
Yeah.
And so, that can sometimes, I have certainly had clients in my life who did not know they were U.S. citizens. And yeah, no, it happens.
Seriously?
Yeah, because of the complex issues of being born outside the U.S.
Oh, my word.
Yeah.
So you've had clients that were U.S. citizens and didn't know it.
Yes. Yes. And exactly. And sometimes they thought they weren't here legally. And it turns out, no, they were actually citizens.
Unreal.
So we've had that several times. And the U.S. government's deported people who are actually
citizens.
U.S. citizens because it's not that obvious if you're born outside the U.S.
Wow.
So, that's the other thing is we're in a continent that there's 3 countries in the continent, right? And there's a lot of back and forth.
Yeah.
And so we don't think about that, but there's a lot of back and forth. And so especially before we had such, our laws became more and more built out and strict over the years. But in the old days, it was more fluid and back and forth. And so there were people, go here, go there, have babies, whatever, and they don't necessarily know.
It reminds me of the time my parents got audited. One of my parents' business got audited by the IRS because they were like, we think you owe us money. And then it turned out the IRS actually owed them money. So they're like, well, you should have kept your mouth shut, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for the check.
Yeah.
So does this change then your day-to-day, like as soon as this EO was signed, does that change what you and your team do?
I'm already getting emails from people with questions.
Including me.
And yes, with you. But people with questions, and things, all kinds of things will come up. I can't even imagine what they'll all be now, but things will come up because the other thing we have to focus on in this executive order is it's not just people who aren't here legally who are affected. It also covers people who are here temporarily, which even though legally, so I have a lot of clients who are here on temporary work visas or they're students or,
That's
whatever.
a good point.
Yeah. And
so you can be here completely legally, not a diplomat, and also obviously have a child that would become a U.S. citizen.
Yes. And so now, one thing for people to understand is that the fact you have a U.S. citizen child does nothing for you in terms of your immigration until that child turns 21. So that's not usually the plan when people have a child, they're just happen to have a child,
Right.
And so now, 21 years later, if they haven't immigrated to the United States or whatever, yes, that child could sponsor them in certain situations. But what it's going to cause, what I'm most concerned about is people right at this moment, is that people living here temporarily and legally will have children who then would no longer be treated as U.S. citizens, but they may not have citizenship in another country, depending on the laws of that country. So you could create a whole class of stateless people who can't get a passport.
Wow.
Anywhere,
Yeah.
And so there are stateless people in the world, but it's not a good thing to be. And so it will have to start influencing people's behavior because they might say, well, I mean, I don't think this is going to stand up. Don't get me wrong, but let's just say it would. They would have to go back to maybe their home country to have their child instead of being here to have their child, which is going to disrupt work. It's going to disrupt studies. It's going to cause, health issues for pregnant women having to get on a plane and go have a baby somewhere. I mean, practically speaking, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So you could,
I want to go back to what you said, which is absolutely fascinating. And again, not a political statement, just a statement of fact, but there's the idea of the anchor baby. This is probably not a term that's a surprise to anybody, but the idea of an anchor baby is someone like is pregnant, they rush over the border, they have their kid, and now they can't be deported or removed from the country at all. If I'm reading between the lines, or maybe I'm not even reading between the lines, it sounds like if you were to have a, quote, anchor baby, unquote, just to use the term, I don't even know if that's offensive or not, I have no clue, that necessarily wouldn't work until that child turns 21. Like they could still, they could still be deported or removed from the country, but then when the child turns 21, they could come back as a naturalized citizen?
Well, yeah. Let me go into it's very confusing because of that term and those.
That's why we invite the professionals here on the Iowa podcast.
Yeah, we're going to help you out with this one. No. So, okay, there's a couple situations. So basically, let's just say you come over and you happen to be visiting or you're going to school and you have a baby. Okay. And that baby's a U.S. citizen. Then you go back to your home country. Okay. That baby remains a U.S. citizen. Now, the baby then, when the baby turns 21, could decide they're going to sponsor their parents under the family-based immigration laws to immigrate to the United States, get a green card. Now, there's lots of process. There's lots of requirements that have to be satisfied. And, it happens, but that's a long time to wait, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's say you're here without status and you have a baby. The baby's a U.S. citizen. However, the baby, first of all, can't sponsor you till you're 21. Second, because you're here unlawfully, there's all kinds of barriers to becoming a permanent resident that are not waived by the fact that you have a U.S. citizen baby.
Interesting.
And you can certainly be deported. There is nothing that will keep you here. And the baby can't sponsor you. If you are deported, that keeps you from immigrating for 10 years itself.
Oh my gosh,
and
really?
So there's all these barriers to utilizing, if you can use that term, which I don't believe people have babies to utilize them, but to utilize this legal process, they it would be, I guess my response is always, well, if people are having a baby to plan for 21 years in the future, they should get an award for planning, not being criticized. But I don't think that's really happening very often.
Here's your citizenship. Just take it. You earned it. My word. That's fun. Okay. Interesting. So yeah, I had a follow-up question on that, but now I lost. Oh, well, this is why maybe people are, you hear of people, boy, I should just ask this in the question. Is there, if you get deported, you have like a 10-year block on naturalization or citizenship. So, right? Is this
or coming back at all?
Or coming back.
Yeah.
Okay. So are we going to see an influx then of people leaving the country to avoid being deported, to ruin their chances of becoming a naturalized citizen? Probably our final question, but are we going to see that then?
I don't know how people will respond to this. Right. I really don't know. People are going to have to make decisions that are in their best interests, and a lot of times the conditions in their home country are such that going back isn't really an option.
Right. Yep.
So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, but it's hard for me to imagine that this will become the law of the land at least anytime soon. And so, yeah, it's an interesting discussion. That's for sure.
It absolutely is. I really appreciate you coming in here. Lori Chesser, immigration attorney and president of Dentons. If people have questions, how can they reach out to you and learn more about this?
Sure. So Dentons Davis Brown, we have a website and we also have our phone number, 515-288-2500. And, glad to help if we can help people with this. Yeah.
Lori, thank you so much for coming on the show and helping me figure out this whole convoluted, bizarre issue. I'm sure this is not the last we will be hearing about it.
Thank you, Justin.
And to my fellow Iowans, Iowa expats, and Iowans at heart, thanks for listening and subscribing to the Iowa Podcast.